Welcome to part 4 on the Civil War. Now we're going to take a look at failure in the East. On July 21st, 1861, a farmer outside of Manassas Junction named Wilbur Mclain was tending his property when all of a sudden a whole bunch of troops came tearing across his fields. Right? They were in full retreat, being chased from an army that had originated in Washington, D.C. This army was under the command of a General Irwin McDowell. And what had happened here was that when the war had first started there in April of 1861, McDowell controlled the armies here around Washington, D.C., and Abraham Lincoln, who readily admitted that he was not very versed in military matters, was deferring to his opinion, right? When can we try and take the Confederates, right? They'd moved their capital from Montgomery to Richmond when Virginia had seceded. When can we go after the Confederate capital? And McDowell had said, well, these troops are all green. We need time. We need time. And Lincoln had deferred to that opinion. But at the same time, he's getting a lot of pressure from Congress, right? When are you going to take them? When are we going to defeat them? Richmond's right there. Why don't we just go get it? Right? And so under this pressure, he was constantly asking McDowell, how about now? Well, they're still kind of green. And finally, by July, when McDowell says his troops were still green, Lincoln's response was, well, yes, but aren't the Confederate soldiers pretty green too? Aren't they doing the same thing? And so that's why on July 21st, 1861, McDowell will attack the Confederates there in what becomes known as the First Battle of Bull Run, right? The North is going to name battles after landmarks like Bull Run Creek, while the South will name battles after nearby towns like Manassas Junction. So they're going to call it the First Battle of Manassas. Okay. And initially, it looks like it's going to be a rout, that the war is going to be over. It's going to be over by August, right? Matter of fact, you're going to see a lot of civilians coming out of Washington, D.C. to watch the great victory of the Union Army against the Confederate rabble, right? So imagine how shocked they were when, during the day of battle, the Confederates finally stopped giving up ground. And for the first time on the battleground, you heard the guttural rebel yell. And they turned and counterattacked the Union forces and sent the forces in full retreat. And Wilbur Mclain watched troops go tearing across his property again. And one Confederate officer even asked if he could use his front room as a temporary headquarters. Right? The people had come out to watch this great victory suddenly saw Union troops just running past them. And these guys weren't just average civilians of Washington, D.C. These were senators and members of the House of Representatives. For example, Senator Henry Wilson is going to be there. He's going to have his buggy destroyed, and he's actually going to have to flee by stealing a mule to escape the battlefield. Senator James Grimes is going to barely escape himself. As a matter of fact, he's going to make a very vocal vow to never get anywhere near a battlefield ever again. But I think the most ironic of these was the New York member of the House of Representatives named Alfred Ely. He's going to come out with a picnic lunch to watch this great victory and find himself as one of the first prisoners of war as he'll be captured and put on parade in Richmond, right? So the forces retreat back to Washington, and the Confederate forces will not pursue them all the way into the city, right? The result of this is, well, there's a few things that happen out of this. First of all, Lincoln decides to organize the army here into what becomes known as the Army of the Potomac, and he puts it under his now most senior officer, General George B. McClellan. Right? McDowell will still be an officer commanding troops in this field, right? The other thing that's going to happen is Wilbur Mclain is going to decide, I don't want to live here anymore. The battlefield's taking place right in my front yard. So he sells his land and he moves to a quieter place in Virginia called Appomattox Courthouse. We might talk about him again later. And General George B. McClellan is going to spend the rest of 1861 training troops. And he's really good at it. He's really good at putting together armies and training them. He's not really good at using them, right? He's kind of like that guy that has that really fancy car that you always see him waxing it on the weekend, but you never actually see him drive the thing. This is how McClellan treats his Army of the Potomac, right? And so he's going to be under constant pressure by the president to use these troops, right? We're providing you with these supplies, you're trying equipment, men, everything else. When are you going to use them? Finally, by the spring of 1862, the pressure from Lincoln becomes too much, and McClellan says, fine, I'm going to use them, but we're not going to use the same route we did before. That wasn't very successful. I have a better plan. I'm going to put these men on ships, and I'm going to take them down, and I'm going to offload them on the peninsula between the James and York rivers, right? And I'm going to move and take Richmond from the southeast, right? And so he does. The Army of the Potomac will steam down there, and they'll land at Fort Monroe on the 7th of March, 1862. And they'll begin marching up towards Richmond, right? Now, one of the first groups that he meets is a group of Confederate forces at Yorktown, right, the historic Yorktown, under the command of Major General John Bankhead Magruder, right? They'll meet up on April 5th, 1862. Now, Magruder's got a pretty good understanding of McClellan. Like I said, great at training troops, not good at using them. And he's also always overestimating his enemy. So what does Magruder do? Well, first he has his men go about and cut trees. He says, I want trees, I want logs that are about this big around and about 8 foot long, and I want you to paint them with pine tar and point them at the enemy. And they do this. They create these Quaker cannons, as they'll call them. And as McClellan's looking through his spy class at the enemy formations, he's like, wow, I cannot believe how many cannons these guys got. They got so many cannons, right? The other thing that Magruder does is he's going to take his troops and actually have them march across clearings, but he's going to have them do it carrying different banners each time. So he's making his small force of men look like a huge force of men. And McClellan, too, he sees this. He goes, wow, they got a lot more men than I thought. And so it makes him really timid as he works his way up the peninsula. And it delays him enough that it gives the Army of the Northern Virginia's commander, General Joseph E. Johnston, time to arrive in Richmond and set up a defense. Okay? So they will finally, McClellan will get close to Richmond, and on May 5th, 1862, the Army of Northern Virginia and the Army of the Potomac will meet up at a place called Williamsburg, right? And then they'll fight again on May 31st at a place called the Battle of Seven Pines. Now, Johnston is going to be injured at the Battle of Seven Pines, which is going to cause his command to turn over to the Confederate General Robert E. Lee. And Robert E. Lee will command the Army of Northern Virginia for the remainder of the war. Lee is a brilliant tactical general, right? And he will attack McClellan 3 weeks later in what becomes known as the 7 Days Campaign. And the attacks will convince McClellan that he's just outmatched and outnumbered, and he'll work his way back down the peninsula, and he'll board ships, and he'll send the Army of the Potomac back to Washington. Lincoln will be so frustrated by this campaign that he's going to sideline McClellan and put the bulk of the army under the command to a commander named Major General John Pope, who's going to mount a disastrous attack on Robert E. Lee in what becomes known as the Second Battle of Bull Run, which will ultimately put McClellan back in charge in time for the battle at Antietam.